Welcome to Freedom Kitchen. I'm Lisa Genza, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm joined by Jeff Bragg from Superfood Consulting. Did you know that potatoes are a superfood? Well, that makes me really happy because I love potatoes and I really had no idea that they were a superfood. Jeff, thank you so much for agreeing to join me today so that you can tell us a little bit more about potatoes, the history, and what makes them a superfood.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I'm proud to be part of this. I want to just tell you that potatoes set me on a journey 42 years ago in 1980. The effect it was going to have on my life through not only health, but understanding more of the history of the most consumed vegetable that we really don't know that much about. And something that we need to know about because potatoes are one, if not the only food that you can actually survive on if that's all you had. And that is what created the melting pot that we know today in the United States. It was actually potatoes that created the migrations into the United States after saving Europe and after realizing now that potatoes were actually the basis of civilization up and down North and South America, especially seeing as how 2 years ago they found the Four Corners potato that grows at 8 to 10,000 feet here in the Four Corners region of the United States. They realized that potatoes were growing on mountaintops all the way up and down the continental divide between North America and South America. Potatoes being one of the only foods you can survive on, the history of how potatoes originated in South America, how they went to Europe, and then came back through Ireland and Prussia into the United States, where potatoes then became the food of the Industrial Revolution that actually fed the Industrial Revolution of the United States. The history of potatoes, I'm going to raise this potato up here. This is a russet potato, and it's a russet potato in that, but the other thing to notice about it, it has red eyes, it has a heavy net. It also has been crossed between potatoes grown in the United States at land grant universities. In this case, it's Texas A&M University. The breeder was a close friend of mine, and it was hard to get this potato into the market because it has a red eye. This is the only identifiable one in the world. The reason why it has red eyes, which is the color of red or purple, it's a food compound called anthocyanin. It's because of this was crossed by a land grant down in South America. It grows small ones. The red of the small ones too is interesting because these baby potatoes you don't see in russets. And now you're going to see little baby potatoes for kids to eat, because when people eat this, because of the history of it, they just love it. Digging today, and a little background information too. This is purslane, and this is a weed. They call it in the United States. In Mexico, it's served in nearly every plate. I was out in the field today, so I wanted to throw that in there, that some of the things that we call weeds are really herbs or other parts of superfoods. Here's a superfood potato. This one is from the Netherlands. It's called Lady Amarilla. And this potato also had its beginnings in Europe, but has been bred in Holland. But let's go back to the history of potatoes and so why we're interested in learning more. The Spaniards took potatoes to Europe as a novelty back in the 1600s. Spaniards took potatoes from Peru. They call Peru the birthplace of potatoes, but in reality, it was the biggest trading area for potatoes. And then the other area close to there is Chile. And so we actually work with potatoes out of the Chilean nation of Chile off of the island of Chiloé, which also was an island that the indigenous people lived off of potatoes as a food year round. Some of the oldest living populations on Earth live strictly off of mainly potato dishes. Will lay out on rocks and dry for winter before they make them into their meals. But back to the Spaniards taking potatoes as a novelty into Europe. They were surviving on cereal crops. They were surviving on bread. That was their main source of carbohydrates. Back to potatoes. So potatoes went to Europe, and two locations made potatoes extremely famous. Ireland is always thought as the birthplace of the Irish potato and whatnot coming to Idaho because of the Great Potato Famine. And it's interesting to know this. The Great Potato Famine in Ireland began its life history in a remote mountaintop in Mexico, where they found the origin of the disease late blight, which is Latin is Phytophthora infestans, which means the great plant destroyer. So that is what that great plant destroyer and what had happened to the Irish is part of the history that makes them a superfood. Potatoes came over. People don't recognize this because potatoes are a lowly commodity now. We go back to the Irish and the Prussians. This is when they first realized the potatoes were a superfood. In France, the liaison for the King of France his name was Parmentier, and it was kidnapped Parmentier by the Prussians. At the same time this was going on, the English were taking all of the crops from the Irish, who were their serfs, if you will, to the English because they had fertile soils and could grow all the cattle, all of the meat and vegetables that they wanted. And potatoes were unheard of at that time. In fact, the word spud comes from a word the English had to prevent their own people from eating potatoes, called Society for the Prevention of Unhealthy Diets. Back to the Prussians, and then back to the Irish, and then what happened to the US and why did it become such a superfood? If you go back to the Prussians, Parmentier was kidnapped by the Prussians and spent 2 years in a jail in Prussia. Meanwhile, back in France, along with all of the other nations in Europe, Russia, Poland, the Netherlands, Germany, every nation, the Netherlands, they were all starving because of a disease that got into their cereal crops, this disease got into their cereal crops throughout Europe, and they were having famine, and they were having starvation, and they were wondering what to do. The royalty of the nations were trying to figure out how to keep their populations alive. Parmentier came back from a Prussian prison and told the King of France, "They have given me potatoes to eat every day for every meal. And look at me," he says, "I'm healthy, I'm surviving." And so that was the first glimpse of potatoes as a superfood. King Louis at the time and Marie Antoinette would put flowers of potatoes in her hair to show how beautiful the potato flowers were, to start enticing the peasants by seeing her look with these flowers. They took a armed guard and put a small batch of potatoes inside of an enclosed encampment surrounded by guards during the daytime. And at night, they would take the guards back away. The peasants, talking amongst themselves, realized that what was in there wasn't anybody watching them. So that's how they went in, took potatoes, and spread them through France. That's what saved France. That's a superfood when it saves you like that. Go north now to Ireland. the sad case of Ireland immigration, and where I came from, Ireland, Scotland, England, that started when the Irish were given just potatoes to eat and everything else removed. The potatoes were the only thing that they had to survive on. The reason why we have immigration and became the melting pot in the United States is because they were living solely off of potatoes up until the disease Phytophthora infestans or light blight came out of Mexico and landed on their leaves unknowingly, and then taking their potatoes into storage where the potatoes rotted. That caused millions of deaths, and that caused the mass immigration. Potatoes caused the immigration from there, Poland, Italy, everywhere else. States. It all relates back to the history of potatoes. When potatoes hit the mainland in the United States, every person that was from Europe knew they could live off potatoes. Potatoes then became a course across from the east, Prince Edward Island and Maine, back across the United States. There is antique potato equipment in every farm, in every state, everywhere. If you look in old antique furniture, because as settling and homesteading moved west, all people raise potatoes for survival. And that is a superfood when you can have one food that you can survive on. So potatoes were the food that fueled the Industrial Revolution. What do we know about them today? Not much more than we knew about them then, because of the power of control.
This is fascinating. I think with the potential or possible food shortages that we're facing, Jeff, this is really vital information for people to know. In listening to and reading up on a lot of information on survival and prepping, potatoes are always mentioned as a survival food because of the caloric content and the fact that we do need carbohydrates in order to survive.
Yes, and so let's talk a little bit further about why they're a superfood. Number one, they can be planted. A portion of them can be ate, and the remaining portion after they sprout can be planted back in the ground again. That planting it back in the ground keeps your food source together. Potatoes are complete food. Potatoes are 85% water on average. So not only do you get all these nutrients and everything, you also get water. Potatoes also are very high in vitamin C. They're higher in vitamin C than oranges. Potatoes are very high in potassium, and they're high in potassium. They're higher in potassium than bananas. Baby potatoes, the little ones, are higher in folic acid than other crops. The colors within potatoes create diversity. They're one of the most diverse crops, especially after you start learning about their characteristics. The reason why potatoes are looked at to be a poor source of food for diabetics is strictly because of the way that they process food. The net on the potatoes, is very high in protein, but you can't eat the potatoes at the store because the reason why they don't sprout in the store is because of one of two reasons. Number one, they put a sprout control agent on, and number two, they keep them at 38 degrees so they won't sprout at a certain temperature. There's a major problem with that. In 1980, taking my first potato science class, I learned never to refrigerate potatoes. So where do you see potatoes at the stores now? You see them in the refrigerated section so they won't sprout. When potatoes fall, let's take the famous potato from Idaho. When you take the potato from Idaho and you take it from 45 degrees up down till it reaches a storage temperature of 45 degrees, it makes a perfect French fry. It's perfect enough to launch many fast food restaurants. The second that it goes below 45 degrees, it turns from 45 to 42, 2 to 300% higher in glucose concentration, simply by storage. So because there's fewer family farms, we rely on the hands of few to feed us so we can have cheap food nation. That's why potatoes are deemed unhealthy from a carbohydrate standpoint. And that's why we need to watch this. And this is the first words that I ever heard from potato scientists, is to never refrigerate potatoes. And now it's commonly practiced, particularly among reds, baby potatoes, and organic potatoes. Unless you know the potato, do not eat a potato unless you know the grower or the season in which it came from, so it's not gone through the temperature change. But they don't tell you this, and they leave it up to your imagination to decide that I didn't know that much, and so I'm just now learning. And now that I've switched from conventional production and prescribing chemicals all across the globe, I now rely on knowing how to grow based on my past as a neighborhood family farmer, growing up in a rotational regenerative farm in South Idaho near the first dam that was placed on the Snake River in Idaho. It was on our property. And so I'm going back to my heritage, and I call it back to the future, because we are very perilously close to having issues with our food chain. We're already having potato shortages as we speak. Potatoes are right now being sold, and the market exceeds supply.
Yeah, which is why this is the perfect time for this. I'm with you. I believe we're going back to the future. We're going back to simpler times, and many of us don't know what that means. You grew up on a family farm, and you were surrounded by family farms. I grew up in the city farm, although I did have my mom's cousins were potato farmers. But this is a really important message that you're bringing, and that is you gave us the history of potatoes. They have been grown in every part of the world. They were grown all across the United States, regardless of elevation. As we migrated west, they have been found on mountaintops. So we know we can grow potatoes. We know that when we grow potatoes, they're healthy for us, particularly if we don't spray any chemicals on them or sprout inhibition or anything else. And these are something we could all grow at home. So we can actually grow potatoes at home.
You can grow them at home. This potato specialist here, he's figured out how to grow them in pots in the wintertime just by having access to opening the curtains. And so what people don't realize is they'll grow in your house, they'll grow in your garden, they'll grow in your lawns, they'll grow anywhere. And they don't have to be in some special soil somewhere, because all soil's special. Because in soil, we have soil flora and fauna that we've killed with massive amounts of green revolution, if you will, that we need to change back to letting the Lord show us the way through photosynthesis.
So this is such great information, because I'm trying to put freedom back into the hands of many people. We have freedom when we choose to take responsibility for what we cook and eat every day. And you're telling us we can actually grow potatoes and that they're a survival food. It sounds like we have more information to cover. And I think that the next question people will want to know is how to grow them, both in pots or in the ground. And I'm sure there's a lot more knowledge there that you would like to share. So hopefully everyone's enjoyed this. I look forward to having you on again.
Very excited to do this, because I think it's the only way to get back to some standards in our own way of living that can help not only ourselves, but our future generations.
Thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to the next time we talk.